They had 48 hours. That's what the sky was telling anyone paying attention. Late October, 1878, Phelps County, Nebraska. The grass had gone the color of old wheat. The cattle on every claim within 5 miles were pressing against the south side of every fence, standing still in the way animals stand when something in the air has changed, and they can feel it in their bones before any human can. Clara Hatch felt it too. She was 15 years old, and she was standing in 3 inches of mud outside a half-caved structure that a man in Minden had called a barn, and she had exactly $12 in her coat pocket, and no mother, no father, and no plan beyond the one her twin sister Nora had sketched on a scrap of paper that morning while they were still sharing a blanket in the back of a dry goods wagon. The plan was to buy the thing and figure out the rest after. 48 hours was probably generous. The temperature was going to fall fast enough to kill them both if they didn't figure out what was inside that wreck of a building and figure out why it might matter. Here is what they actually found, and here is the physics of why it saved them. Their parents died in September. Their mother went first scarlet fever, which moved through the wagon camp at the Turkey Creek, crossing the way fire moves through dry grass, taking whomever it could catch. Their father lasted 11 days longer, long enough to bury her, long enough to tell the girls the name of a man in Minden who owed him $14 for a harness sale. Then the fever took him too. The wagon camp was not a cruel place, but it was a practical one. There were 23 adults and 9 children in that camp, and they were trying to reach their winter claims before the ground locked solid, and 2 15-year-old girls with no parents. No livestock and no deed to anything were a calculation nobody wanted to make. The camp boss, a man named August Ferris, from Decatur County, Iowa, held a meeting. He was not a bad man. He laid out the situation plainly. The camp had its own mouths to feed, its own fuel to gather, its own shelters to raise before November. He could not feed 2 extra people through a Nebraska winter. He gave Clara and Nora 3 days of food from the common store cornmeal, a half-pound of salt pork, and a tin of rendered lard. He gave them the smaller of the 2 camp tents, which leaked at the back seam. He told them about the man in Minden who owed their father money, and he pointed them down the road. 23 adults watched them walk away. Nobody said anything particularly cruel. Nobody said anything at all. The $14 from the harness debt was real, Mr. Cobb in Minden paid it in paper without argument, looked at the 2 of them standing across his counter for a long moment, and then said he believed there was an old Halverson claim 3 miles east that had sat unclaimed since Halverson quit Nebraska in the summer. The structure on it wasn't worth calling a barn, he said, but the land had never been formally relinquished. If they had $12 for the filing fee and the agent's commission, they could put their name on it before the ground froze and no one else could touch it. Clara asked him what the structure looked like. Cobb looked out his window for a moment and said the roof was mostly down. The east wall went with it, and that old Halverson used to keep 2 horses in there. They had $12 and $2 left over after the filing. They used the $2 on nails, a hand axe, and 4 yards of canvas. The structure, when they found it that afternoon, was worse than Cobb had let on. The east wall had not simply fallen. It had folded inward, the way a card table folds when one leg gives out, and the roof had ridden it down at an angle, so that the east third of what had been a 30 by 20 foot barn was now a compressed mass of cedar shingles, split oak planking, and hand-hewn timber, all of it lying at roughly a 40-degree slope, like a ramp someone had built to nowhere. The west wall and the back north wall were still standing, though the north wall had a gap at the top corner where the rafters had pulled free. The standing walls were built from cottonwood planks, rough sawn and dried so thoroughly that the boards had shrunk away from each other, leaving gaps you could slide 3 fingers through. The floor, where there was floor, was bare earth. Nora walked the perimeter once without saying anything. She was the quieter of the two. She had their father's way of going still when she was thinking, standing at the edge of something, measuring it with her eyes instead of words. Clara walked inside the standing section and looked up at the sky through the gap in the north corner. She could feel the wind coming through the board gaps. "It smells like horses," she said. Nora said it was good, and she was already crouching at the edge of the collapsed section, pulling at a cedar shingle. What Nora had noticed, and what Clara understood the moment she crouched down beside her, was that the collapsed roof section had not simply made a mess, it had made a ceiling. The east wall, when it fell, had come to rest against the standing west wall at roughly chest height. The roof timbers were piled on top of it in a dense, overlapping mass that had been sitting there since sometime in the spring, long enough for the grass and weeds to grow up around the edges and partially seal the sides. What looked like a pile of wreckage from the outside was, from the inside, a low enclosed space maybe 6 feet across, 5 feet deep at the deepest point where the angle was most gradual, and perhaps 4 feet high at the tallest. You had to bend to get inside. The floor was dirt, tamped down from years of horse hooves. The smell of horses was everywhere. Old manure, dried and dusty. Hay residue pressed into the earthen floor. The scent of animals that had spent many winters in this exact spot. Nora told Clara to put her hand down on the floor. Clara pressed her palm flat against it. It was not warm, exactly, but it was not cold either. Whatever temperature the earth held underneath, it was not the temperature of the October air outside. She left her hand there for a full minute. The floor was 50 degrees, maybe 52. The outside air was 38 and dropping. Nora said the horses had kept that floor warm for years, and when the roof came down, it trapped it. That was not quite the whole explanation, though it was close enough to be useful. What Nora had instinctively grasped was something that engineers today would call geothermal buffering. Below a certain depth, the earth in southern Nebraska maintains a near constant temperature year-round. In Phelps County, that baseline runs between 50 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the surface air is doing, whether it's 95 degrees in August or negative 20 inches January. At 3 feet down, the Earth simply does not participate in whatever is happening at the surface. The temperature at that depth is set by the slow bleed of heat from the planet's interior and the long average of many seasons, not by any individual day. The floor of that collapsed space had years of animal warmth pressed into it on top of that. 2 horses, living through multiple winters in that stall, each putting out roughly 3,500 to 4,000 British thermal units of heat per hour, the same output as a small electric space heater running continuously. That heat had been going somewhere for years. It went into the floor, it went into the walls, it went into every surface those animals touched and breathed on. And then the roof came down, and all that stored warmth had nowhere to go. They worked for the rest of that afternoon and into the dark. Clara started pulling hay debris away from the base of the collapsed section, piling it against the outside of the standing west wall, not to clear it away, but to add to it, to thicken the layer between the interior and the wind. Every scrap of old straw, every matted clump of hay that had rotted at the surface but stayed dry underneath, she packed it tight against the outside boards, working from the ground up. By the time the light failed, she had built a wall of packed hay debris 2 feet thick against the full length of the west wall, from the ground to about shoulder height. She did not know the term dead air insulation. She had never heard of thermal conductivity. But she had grown up on a farm in Indiana before her family started west, and she knew one specific and practical thing. When you pack hay tightly around a building in the fall, the building stays warmer. Every farmer in the Midwest knew this. Some called it banking. What she was doing had a precise physical reason that goes deeper than folk knowledge. Still air. Air that is not moving is one of the best natural insulators on Earth. It conducts heat at approximately 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin, which is to say it moves heat very slowly from warm to cold. The problem is that air doesn't stay still. As it warms near a heat source, it rises. As it cools, it sinks. This convection is what carries heat out of any structure when the outside air is cold. Packed hay stops this process. The hay fibers divide the airspace into millions of tiny pockets so small that convection can't happen, the air can't circulate, because it has nowhere to go. It just sits there, still, holding. The heat on one side stays on one side. The cold on the other side stays on the other. A loose-packed hay wall of 12 inches has an R value of approximately 15 better than the fiberglass insulation in most modern homes. Clara built 24 inches of it. She didn't calculate the R value. She just kept packing until her arms gave out. Nora, meanwhile, was solving a different problem. The collapsed interior space was habitable in the sense that it existed and was out of the wind, but it was not sealed. The sides where the collapsed roof met the standing walls had gaps, places where a draft could enter, where cold air could pool, where warmth would bleed out through the night. She crawled along each gap with a handful of hay, pressing it into every crack until the draft stopped. Then she crawled out and used the canvas they had bought to seal the opening, the low, angled entrance to the interior space, tacking it to the surviving timbers with the nails and the back of the hand axe. When she crawled back inside and pulled the canvas flap shut behind her, something noticeable happened. The sound changed. Wind that had been a constant presence, not loud, but there, like someone breathing on the back of your neck, went quiet. Not completely, but enough that you noticed its absence more than its presence. Nora told Clara to try the floor again. Clara pressed her hand flat. The floor still read about 50 degrees, but now the air inside the small space, 4 feet high, 6 feet across, 5 feet deep, was warmer than it had been. Their own body heat, which had been escaping freely before the canvas went up, was now staying in the space. 2 human bodies put out about 330 British thermal units per hour at rest. In a sealed space, roughly 120 cubic feet in volume, that added up faster than it sounds. Clara said they needed something warm in there with them, and Nora was already thinking the same thing. They needed the cow. There was one cow. She had belonged to Halverson too, or to someone Halverson had known. She was thin and had been running wild on the claim since spring, living on whatever grass she could find. And by October she was not in good shape, but she was alive, and she was approximately where she had always been, because cattle, even unfed cattle, tend to stay near the last place that felt safe. Clara spent the better part of an hour convincing the cow to come inside the collapsed space. This involved removing the canvas flap, lying flat on the ground and crawling in first so the cow could see it was possible, and then going back out and pushing from behind, while Nora pulled from the front with a length of old harness rope they had found in the debris. The cow's name, as far as they could tell, had been nothing. They called her November. November was approximately 900 pounds and unhappy about the arrangement, but she was also tired and cold, and once she was inside barely and the canvas went back up, something shifted in her posture. She stood still. Her breathing slowed. A 900-pound cow at rest produces between 3,500 and 4,000 British thermal units of metabolic heat per hour. That number comes from the same physics that governs how the body burns food and releases energy. The cow's digestive system is essentially a slow chemical furnace, converting grass and stored fat into heat and motion. A resting cow puts out roughly the same thermal energy as a small propane space heater running on its low setting. In a 120 cubic foot space that was now hay insulated on 3 sides, had a 50-degree earthen floor, and was sealed against outside air by a canvas flap, 3,500 British thermal units per hour from a single animal was not a modest contribution. It was the difference between a space that holds 35 degrees through the night and a space that holds 55. By the time Clara and Nora had settled into the hay on either side of the cow's flank, pulling the remaining canvas over themselves as a blanket, the inside of that space was warmer than any building they had been in since crossing into Nebraska. Outside, the wind had shifted northwest. A blue norther is a particular type of cold front that sweeps down across the Great Plains from the Canadian north, not gradually, not over the course of a day the way most cold fronts move, but in hours, sometimes in under an hour. The leading edge of the cold air is visible from a distance as a dark blue-grey line low on the horizon, moving south at the speed of something with intent. On the 28th of October, 1878, one of these fronts hit Phelps County, Nebraska, at approximately 11 o'clock at night. The temperature on that evening had been 32 degrees Fahrenheit when Clara and Nora settled in with November. By 3 in the morning, it was 6 degrees. By dawn, it was -8. The wind, which had been building since midnight, was running at 40 miles per hour out of the northwest. Not a blizzard wind, no snow with it, just dry. Savage cold, moving fast across the open ground. Wind chill at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with a 40 miles per hour. Wind produces a felt temperature of approximately -40 degrees. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 10 minutes. Cattle left in open pasture or in thin-walled barns with no wind protection begin to die by morning. 3 claims within 2 miles of the Halverson property had settled families on them. That October, the Brower family from Ohio, who had a sod house with a small stove, the Peterson brothers from Iowa, who had a framed shanty with 1 layer of boards and no banking at all, and a man named Walt Gruber, who had arrived too late to do much of anything, and was living in a wagon with canvas sides. Gruber's 2 oxen were dead by sunrise. He found them standing, which sometimes happens in extreme cold. The death precedes the falling, and by the time the muscles relax, they are already frozen in position. The Peterson brothers burned their furniture on the 2nd day. The temperature inside their shanty dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit because the boards had shrunk in the cold, opening gaps along every seam, and the fire they were trying to build couldn't keep pace with the heat leaving through those gaps as fast as they could produce it. A thin-walled structure in a 40 miles per hour. Wind is not a shelter in any meaningful sense. It is a very slow passage between outside and outside. The Brower family was warmer because sod walls are thick and dense and retain heat reasonably well, but their stove was burning through firewood at a rate they had not planned for. And by the 4th day of the freeze, the blue norther did not lift fully until November 3. They were burning fence posts. Inside the collapsed space, on the morning of October 29, Clara pressed her hand against the earthen floor and found it at 52 degrees. The air was warmer than that. November the cow had not stopped putting out heat through the night, and the hay-packed walls had held most of it inside. By Clara's best estimate, which was admittedly imprecise, the inside air temperature was somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees. Not warm in any comfortable sense, but survivable, and comfortable enough that she had actually slept, which surprised her. Nora had the lard tin out and was burning a small twist of hay as a wick. The rendered fat caught easily and burned slowly. Animal fat has approximately 17,000 British thermal units per pound, nearly twice the energy of dried hardwood, and the small flame added both light and a modest supplemental heat source to the space. The smoke went up through a gap between the canvas and the timber she had deliberately left partially unsealed at the top, creating just enough air exchange to keep the space breathable without allowing significant cold infiltration. This was not an accident. Nora had thought about it the previous afternoon. A sealed space that holds a cow and 2 humans generates carbon dioxide, as well as warmth. The gap was small, maybe an inch, but it served the same function as a modern passive house ventilation system, a controlled, minimal air exchange that replaces stale air without losing significant heat. She had reasoned it out from the fact that their father's barn in Indiana had always had a small gap at the peak of the roof, and the animals inside were always fine, and the neighbour's barn, fully sealed, had lost 3 pigs one winter to what the neighbours called bad air. On the second day, Walt Gruber knocked on the canvas. This is the part of the story that surprised Clara most when she thought about it later. Not that Gruber found them. The canvas flap was visible from the road, and anyone passing would have noticed it and wondered. What surprised her was that he knocked. He was frostburned across both cheeks and had wrapped his hands in a feed sack. His 2 oxen were dead, and his wagon canvas had partially collapsed under the weight of wind-blown debris. He was alive because he had spent both nights under the wagon body itself, in the narrow space between the wagon bed and the frozen ground, which had provided just enough wind protection to keep him from losing consciousness. Clara pulled the canvas back and let him in. The warmth hit him so hard he sat down without asking if he could. November shifted her weight and looked at him the way cows look at strangers without opinion. Gruber looked at the cow, the hay walls, the lard flame, and asked how it was this warm in there. He was doing the arithmetic slowly, the way a man does when something doesn't compute. Clara told him to put his hand on the floor. Gruber pressed his palm down, his face changed. Nora told him the cow did the rest, that she had been running all night. Gruber had been farming for 11 years. He had wintered cattle in Ohio, in Missouri, in Kansas. He understood immediately, once he was looking at it. What had happened, he just had not thought to look for it, because looking for warmth in a pile of collapsed lumber was not the kind of thinking a man does when he has a wagon and a plan. He stayed 4 days. He chopped wood from the collapsed timber debris and fed November from the hay reserves Clara had been piling inside. On the 5th day, when the wind had dropped enough to be survivable, he walked to the Brower claim and helped them bring their family to the collapsed space for 2 more days until the temperature climbed above 0. The Browers, Friedrich and Mathilde, and their 3 children, ages 6 and 9 and 11, had to fold themselves into the remaining space around the cow, which by that point had stopped seeming unusual to anyone. Children sleep against large, warm animals with a naturalness that adults tend to lose. The Brower children were asleep within 20 minutes. Word reached the men at the Minden Land Office on November 8th, when Gruber walked in to report his oxen and see about the paperwork for the abandoned Halverson claim, which he did not know was no longer abandoned. The land agent's name was Theodore Mack. He listened to Gruber's account of the 2 girls, the collapsed barn, the cow, the lard lamp, the Brower family. He wrote some of it down in the margin of another document because he did not have a fresh piece of paper at hand. The margin note survived because the document was a deed registry that the Phelps County Historical Office kept through several subsequent moves. The notes say, Halverson Ruin, 2 girls Hatch, name, orphans off wagon train. Bought claim Oct 27, survived the norther in the East Fall, had a cow, neighbours sheltered there, Gruber, Brower family, 6 days total, all lived. Most people think of shelter as a barrier. You build 4 walls and a roof, and the cold stays outside and the warm stays inside. That is the basic model, and it is also why most standard frontier cabins, thin boards, single-wall construction, a stove burning continuously, were so fragile in extreme cold. The moment the stove went out, the temperature inside began tracking the temperature outside. Heat poured through every gap in the boards, every chink between logs, every place where the builder had used green wood that later shrank. The stove wasn't warming a building, it was fighting a continuous loss. What Clara and Nora had, without naming any of it, was a system that minimized the loss to begin with. The first layer was the earthen floor. Below 3 feet in Phelps County, Nebraska, the ground sits at approximately 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter what is happening at the surface. This is not warmth from any recent event, it is warmth from the average of decades of seasons. stored in dense soil that changes temperature so slowly it barely registers month to month. The collapsed space had been heated by horses for years before the roof came down. That heat was stored in the top several inches of soil and in every timber and board that horses had breathed on through winter after winter. The second layer was the hay banking. Clara's 2-foot-thick wall of packed hay on the exterior of the standing west wall was not decorative. Packed hay immobilizes air. Immobilized air cannot convect. Heat cannot conduct through still air at any meaningful rate. A 2-4-inch packed hay wall provides insulation roughly equivalent to R30, the standard recommended by modern building codes for attic insulation in cold climates, achieved by 2 girls with their hands and no tools. The third layer was the collapsed roof debris itself. A pile of cedar shingles, split oak planking, and old-growth timber 18 inches deep creates the same dead air effect as the hay banking. The gaps between the boards are filled with still air. The weight of the pile compresses the spaces to a scale where convection is impossible. The debris pile covering the eastern portion of the shelter was, functionally, the best insulated roof on any structure within 3 miles, not despite being ruined but because of how it had settled. The fourth layer was November. A 900-pound cow at rest outputs 3,500 to 4,000 British thermal units per hour. A modern 1,500-watt electric space heater produces about 5,100 British thermal units per hour. The cow was running at roughly 70% of that, continuously, through every hour of every night. In a 120 cubic foot space, that much metabolic heat, the byproduct of a digestive system breaking down stored grass and fat, was enough to raise and hold the interior temperature roughly 15 to 20 degrees above what it would have been without. 2 human bodies, which each output about 165 British thermal units per hour, at rest roughly equivalent to a 50-watt bulb, were adding their share on top of that. When you add it all up, geothermal floor at 52 degrees, hay banking at R30 equivalent, debris pile roof at R25 or better, 4,000 British thermal units per hour from the cow, 330 British thermal units per hour from the 2 girls, a canvas entrance flap that eliminated wind infiltration, and a single 1-inch vent gap for air exchange. You have a system that maintained 45 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit inside, while the effective outside temperature was -40. That gap from -40 to +50 is 90 degrees of separation. An iron stove burning green cottonwood in a single-wall board shanty with gaps in the seams would be lucky to maintain 20 degrees of separation in that wind. It would burn through a cord of wood in 4 days and still leave you cold. Clara and Nora Hatch, 15 years old, with $12 and a hand axe and a cow they did not own 3 days before the storm hit, maintained 90 degrees of separation through 6 days of one of the worst October cold fronts in Nebraska's recorded history. They did it with packed hay, collapsed timber, a 50-degree floor, and a 900-pound animal they called November. Theodore Mack, the land agent, finished filling out the Hatch claim paperwork on November 9th, 1878, the day after Gruber came into his office. He recorded both names Clara Hatch and Nora Hatch as joint claimants under the head of household provision available to orphaned siblings. He noted their ages as 15 and did not comment on them further. The girls proved up the claim in 1883. By that point, they had rebuilt the east wall and added a proper roof, though they kept the packed hay banking around the exterior every winter and never saw a reason to stop. They had acquired 2 more cattle, a pair of pigs, and a small kitchen garden. The cow they called November died in the spring of 1882 at an age that made the Minden veterinarian shake his head slowly when they described her purchase price history. Nora married a man named James Albrecht in 1885 and remained on the claim. Clara stayed through 1887 then filed a separate claim 4 miles south, which she worked alone until 1891 when she sold it, and used the proceeds to attend the Nebraska State Normal School in Peru. What she studied there was not recorded. The claim itself, the old Halverson property, Phelps County, Section 14, Township 6, changed hands 4 more times before the end of the century. By 1910 there was a proper frame house on it, and no trace of the collapsed structure that had kept 6 people and a cow alive through 6 days of a blue norther in October 1878. The physics that made it work have not changed. The earth in Phelps County still sits at 52 degrees below 3 feet. Packed hay still traps air at the same R value it always did. A cow at rest still puts out 3,500 British thermal units per hour. People who build passive houses today, structures designed to maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal active heating, use the same principles. They call them thermal mass, dead air insulation, and internal heat gain. They have very sophisticated computer models that calculate exactly how much of each to use. Clara Hatch calculated it with her hands in the dark. She pressed the hay into the gaps until the drafts stopped, and she kept pressing until her arms gave out. Then she crawled inside with her sister and a cow and waited for the storm to break. The storm broke. They were still there when it did. So was everyone they had let in.